This is Jeffrey Madoff, and welcome to our podcast called Anything and Everything with my partner, Dan Sullivan.
Hi, everybody. It's a Sunday afternoon, and I'm having my Sunday afternoon conversation with Jeff Madoff, who's in New York, and he is a father, so he's legitimate. I'm a pretender. So anyway, Jeff, some interesting articles recently about technology, especially one that was triggered by a unusual mistake. I say unusual because usually Apple is better than this, but they came out with a commercial for the iPad, the new iPad. I guess it's a new iPad. And it shows I guess it's a car crusher or something like that crushes existing technology. And they've said all the technologies of human creativity are now being crushed. And in its place is the iPad. And it really didn't work. This commercial really didn't work, and I think it didn't bring up all sorts of questions about the commercial. It brought up all sorts of questions about Apple, and what's happening at Apple that this got through all the safety checks.
Yeah, and I think it raises questions about where we're at as a culture now, too, because technology has been such a driver of global economy, and there's a transition going on. Mm-hmm. But before we started recording, Dan and I usually talk for 30 minutes before we even start recording.
Listening up.
Yeah, just, stretching, doing vocal exercises, all of that. And you were talking about humanity and subsets. And love to lead in that way because that was very interesting.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting mathematical formula that was created by, I think he was an Austrian mathematician, 1930s. It's called the Incompleteness Theory. And the creator is a mathematician by the name of Kurt Gödel, Goedel. And Einstein said that he thought that he was the foremost mathematician of the 20th century. And they actually worked together at Princeton. They ended up at Princeton together. Both came over before the Second World War. But he came up with an incompleteness theorem, which in layman's terms says you can't be part of a system and understand the system that you're in. That's how it gets translated. And he was talking about how it's led to a discussion about technology, and especially about intelligent technology, which we're in the throes of since OpenAI came out with ChatGPT. And there's always been this theme in the technological world that at a certain point, the increase of speed of technology, the computing power of technology, is going to exceed human intelligence. And I've always personally been very, very skeptical about this notion. And my thing, using Gödel's mathematics, that all technology is created by humans, that we know of, that we use, is created by humans, and therefore technology is subordinate to humanity, and therefore, according to Gödel's theory, that you can't be a creation of humanity and understand the creator. Essentially, that's a form of mathematics called set theory. You have the set, and then you have the subsets, and everything that humanity has created is a subset of the set called humanity. So my belief is that it's impossible for a technology created by human beings to actually understand or surpass human thinking.
And it's interesting because it makes me think of one of the phrases that's used a lot in self-help and direct marketing, which is, if you're inside the jar, you can't read the label.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a subset of Gordian mathematics.
And mason jars.
Yeah, mason jars. Yeah. I'm not sure what prompts this line of thinking. I don't know about you, but I found that I only have direct access to one human being for the last 80 years, and it's a full-time job, so I don't... Yeah. I mean, I think it falls under the category of anything and everything, but we've just never really talked about this particular thought that's out there. It's called the singularity, and a man by the name of Ray Kurzweil is its foremost proponent. And he's predicting 2029, the speed of technology, the thinking capability of technology will be so great that it surpasses human intelligence. I remember Peter Diamandis says, "What do you think it's going to be like when that happens?" I said, "It'll just be another day."
Yeah, just like the change to the 2000s.
Yeah.
I forget what that was now called, but
Y2K.
right. Yeah,
Will anyone notice?
that's right.
Speed is sort of magical and it's also misleading. I mean, my thermostat in my house is obviously smarter than I am about, adjusting temperature throughout the day. And
Uh-huh.
there's lots of technologies that are way faster than us. But is that thinking? Is that thinking?
Well, that's what I was going to ask. And I do want to give just a footnote to any of those who are interested in Gödel's theories that there is a book that was very popular. I think it was probably in the 80s. I don't remember for sure, but Gödel, Escher, Bach, which was very popular and a really interesting book to read.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question because, first of all, if you set a deadline for something, it gives you all the way up to that deadline to sell something that'll counteract it. It markets something that'll counteract it. And then there's the shift from 1999 to 2000, and everybody's sort of waiting, and nothing happens. So, so then what? Well, 2029, that's when it's happening.
I remember everybody was keen about the New Year's celebrations in Australia when Y2K happened. They had worldwide coverage of the fireworks in Sydney Harbor because Sydney is really the first major metropolitan area that encounters the new day.
Right.
Seemed to go fine, and then got to Tokyo, and Tokyo was fine. And by 3 o'clock in the morning, you were, I think things are going to be okay.
It seems to be there's a tendency to be hyperbolic about any major shift that seems to be happening. And, somehow we get through leap year, and nothing really happens. And a person who was born on leap year, my niece was, she ages like the rest of us. And, it's kind of.
She doesn't get as many gifts, but.
That's right. Yes.
She's easy.
That's right. Feels cheated, but, it's with Apple, what I think was so interesting with the commercial, I think it was called Crush. Advertising and marketing is always trying to sell us something. That's, the great Shakespearean question, modified a bit, which is to buy or not to buy. I think that the question that's come up as of late is why buy? Like, people don't feel the compelling reason to buy a new phone every 12 to 18 months. And what can it really offer? How many different lenses do you need on your phone camera? All of this different stuff. And I think that there was a great period of innovation. That innovation to many was seductive. They wanted to keep up to date on the new releases of the new iPhone. People that would line up around the block for the new iPhone, I'm willing to bet that they all had functioning phones. So why they'd want to sleep outdoors other than be able to say to their friends, yeah, did you see me on the news? They took pictures on the Apple store on Fifth Avenue and we're all around the block. But everybody had a phone that worked. And I think that the compelling reason to buy things has shifted and technology has shifted. And this is with Apple, it's with Microsoft, it's with many of the major companies. Google is AI. And now there's all kinds of people out there promoting themselves as AI experts. Here's how to use AI, supercharge your business. And I have the same question that you have, which is speed is one thing, but speed doesn't define intelligence. in computers, it's about retrieval time. So I think that it's really interesting to start looking at why do we buy? And when something is offered like this new iPad that shows the destruction of all of the current tools, you see paint being squashed and typewriter being squashed and all kinds of things, an artist's wooden figure being squashed, all of these things. And then Apple tells you it's the thinnest iPad yet. And I'm sure, just like me, you've heard millions of people saying, that goddamn fat iPad, it's way too clunky. That was not the case. And it played into, to your point, what were they thinking? Played into all of the fears and insecurities that people have about AI, that it's going to take over all these things.
Yeah. Yeah, but who's scared? I mean, who's really scared? I think the technology people are. I mean, the greatest fear that if you're in the technology business, because you're getting people to spend present money on future possibility, what if people just aren't into it anymore? I mean, what happens to their stock price? What happens to their valuation? But I've got a sense that we're in a bit of a pause right now, because you used a word before, globalization. You used the global market. There's a whole set of books written by a man by the name of Peter Zion, and he's a practitioner of geopolitics, and there aren't many of them around anymore. I came across him in 2014, and he wrote a book on how the U.S. had become the superpower in the world. And he said it was not intentional. The Americans never intended this. It's just that everybody else was either destroyed or they quit. In 1945, the Second World War ends, and the U.S. economy was half the global GDP. America had half of it. It's about 25%. I think they're 26% now because everybody rebuilt and everybody got back into the game. And the U.S., going back to Washington, he resigned after 2 terms. He resigned, and that set a precedent that most presidents stuck to. And he said the biggest danger that America has is getting involved in global affairs, getting involved in the troubles of other countries. We got this big continent, and we should be able to make do with what we have. And America has always had a disinterest in the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a big place, it's 3,000 miles, across. Essentially, the states are like countries. Each state is a substantial economic unit. And the U.S. did a deal, which was done in New Hampshire at Bretton Woods in 1944. And they did a deal with all the Allied countries during the Second World War, where they said, look, we got to rebuild the whole global economy. So here's what we're willing to do is that, first of all, the dollar is going to be the currency of exchange for everybody. Everything we're talking about here is going to be in U.S. dollars because we have the only economy that can back up the currency. And we'll lend massively. We can lend you enormous amounts of money. And you rebuild your economy and you can industrialize and either regain where you were or build from new. And you can ship your stuff, and the U.S. Navy will guarantee the waterways. And you can sell into the United States, and there won't be any tariffs. But we're doing this because we don't want to go to war with the Soviets in Europe. So we're going to ask you, from a military standpoint, to be between us and the Soviets. So it wasn't done for economic reasons. It was done for security reasons, because Americans don't like seeing their taxpayers coming back in coffins.
Well, yes, but I would push back a bit and say that it is also for economic reasons, because what ends up happening, and I don't think Washington could have anticipated it, is a global economy. Yeah. And the dependencies that are a result of that, whether it's Middle Eastern oil or whether it was after World War II for a while, inexpensive goods, cheap goods. I mean, made in Japan used to mean cheap. Mm-hmm. And then, like with Sony, that was started with government money in rebuilding Japan. To the younger listeners, they may not realize this, but Sony was the Apple of its day. Best design stuff, really cool, had a visionary, Akira Morita, who ran it. So it's much more lucrative to deal with a global economy. So you're correct about the taxpayers. You also don't want to kill your customers.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a lot of them.
The one thing that you point out, though, that even at the height of the global economy, America didn't have much to do with it. The foreign trade only represents a little bit more than 10% of the U.S. economy. It's mostly Americans creating things and selling it to other Americans because it's the greatest consumer market ever created.
Right.
Is the American. And everybody wants to be in on that consumer market.
Right.
I'm only saying this was all premised on the existence of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, America said, okay, that's kind of taken care of. And everybody had such a sweet deal. I never saw a major historical event happen like the collapse of, land-wise, the biggest empire in the history of the world, and it just collapsed. I mean, if they had asked permission, can we collapse now? Nobody would have given them permission, Yeah. And the reason was the deals that supported the global economy were so sweet that nobody wanted to know everything changed. But the American taxpayers noticed it because they were paying a lot for the support of this global structure. Okay. I'm only positioning this back to the beginning of our discussion today, is that this is when the high-tech world took off. It was in the 70s and 80s that the high-tech, and most of the really inventive stuff really happened in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the internet appears in the early 90s, but the internet had been a military research network for 15 years. ARPANET had been there before, and, the integrated circuit had been created in the 60s and everything. It just got to the consumer level in the 70s and 80s, but all the technology really was already there.
Yeah, and lots of it that was driven in the technology pushes forward in World War II.
Yeah, and ongoing military. The military's always been a big part. Yeah, I mean, there's an organization called DARPA, which is a major, major innovator of technology. Nobody really knows about it. But, the way technology advances, I heard somebody say there's three things where technology advances very quickly. One of them is weapons. The second one is games. And the third one is porn.
Yeah, and having been in the video business for as long as I've been in it, porn was one of the biggest innovators. They created the video jukeboxes. A lot of those innovations in video and home video and video rentals and all of that stuff that even led to Netflix. I mean, all of that stuff started, you're right, in porn. And the interesting thing is that the games, the vast majority are some form of Warcraft, which is also kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's the biggest participation sport in the world is online gaming. It's in the billions, the number of people who in a year will engage in some sort of video game online. But I mean, to make simple our discussion here, what if the tech companies are encountering a possibility that there aren't any more new customers for new things?
Well, I'd like to get to that too, because I think that's a fascinating discussion, because people have to have a reason to buy, right? And if you've already got X, you don't need to buy X again. And, there's been a cycle, be it the new phones or the new iPad or whatever, at a certain point, which has happened with the phones already, it's incremental. It's not a major wave of innovation anymore. So I wonder, what was Apple thinking when, they don't make snap decisions? It's not a stupid company. And how was that idea pitched internally? And what were they telling us in that commercial? And why would they expect us to buy what they were selling? And by the way, Apple pulled that commercial almost immediately. There was so much negative blowback. And the negative blowback also spills over into AI. whether it was Scarlett Johansson saying, no, you cannot use my name. And Blankman-Fried called her up to try to say, well, we'll license the sound of your voice. And she said, no. So I think there is a battle which is set up by business about the technology versus the humanity.
Mhm.
And how do we protect the creators who are the backbone of new things?
Mhm.
And I'll toss one other thing because I'd love to hear your answer is we talked about speed. AI is incredible because computers are incredible in terms of the speed of information retrieval, pattern recognition, but thinking, not so sure. Pattern recognition isn't thinking, it's recognition of recurring patterns. So how do you define intelligence?
Well, first of all, it's not information processing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because that's the contention of the singularity people, that the human brain is an information processor, computers are information processor, and the speed of computing is advancing very, very quickly, but human processing isn't any different than it was with the Greeks. It's probably not really advanced that much. Biologically, I don't think we've improved all that much as thinkers. Therefore, at a certain point, the speed of computing will be faster and it will involve all information retrieval on the planet. And therefore, it would be artificial intelligence will be superior to human intelligence. It all hangs and falls on that contention that we're information processors.
Which isn't the case. If you talk to a neuroscientist,
We're terrible information processors.
well, we're terrible information processors, but that's also even not what our brain really does. It does some of that from just survival evolution.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting because intelligence is something else. It's not the speed of retrieval. Speed of retrieval is speed. But do we understand anything more as a result of that? And who's serving what? New York Times has sued Microsoft. There's been a number of publications and creative individuals that have sued for the misappropriation of their information that's being used to create what happens. What's mistaken for intelligence in AI is generative and predictability.
Mm-hmm.
That's not intelligence. That's just saying this pattern leads to this outcome, but its ability to predict is not very good.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think, by the way, it's always amazed me with Wall Street, is you would think all those fractions and all that information, that there's got to be somebody who can always unlock the Rosetta Stone of investing, which is just not the case.
Yeah, it's like the final scene in the Lehman trilogy. When all the numbers, he's just fixated with data. It's not even customers, it's just data. You're just making your decision on data. Yeah, well, I wrote one of my small quarterly books. The title of it is You Are Not a Computer. What I say in there is that we're meaning makers. We create new meaning. And I mean, the most powerful structure that has evolved with humans over hundreds of thousands of years, wherever you think the starting point is that we're a distinctly different entity on the planet, is the story.
Mm-hmm.
The story is the most powerful cultural structure that there is. We grade our interest in how good the story is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't think stories are information processing. I think stories are the raw materials coming from someplace else.
I agree.
That's not information retrieval.
That's right. And so you can establish the patterns of a story.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that you can then tell a good story.
Oh.
And so you might understand that, but what is it that makes somebody cry? What is it that makes somebody laugh? What is it that surprises somebody, that scares somebody? All of these things that are essential parts of great stories. In other words, people have to feel something. They don't feel something for data. You have to feel something as a result. And I think it's been already fairly established because there was, in advertising and marketing, there was a real subservience to the god of big data,
mm-hmm.
which just hasn't proven to be the panacea for business,
Yeah.
which is, I think, quite interesting.
Where have you encountered that in the marketing world where it was almost like a new religion?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, where have you seen that?
I have seen it, whether it's companies that are determining what sells and therefore what they should make in the future. So the data tells them that people are buying this kind of thing, which never lasts because public taste is fickle and you don't know when it's going to pivot off to something else. You have no idea. In book sales, the same thing in the categories and whatever. In doing the play, when I send you out the update for our next step with personality in London, it's the same thing. There's certain things that there isn't any data. And then there's a lot of things what they have, but it's not a full picture at all in terms of, well, who's buying tickets. And one of the problems I have with that is when the claims are made about what the data says. And I said, well, if you went to McDonald's, you would find that nobody eats lobster. Why? Because it's not offered there. So their data is going to show them that it basically there's no market for lobster. So where are you harvesting your information from? What are the questions that you're asking? In AI, it's all about the prompts in order to get anything. And it's still, still pretty rudimentary. Mm-hmm. And the consistency is not very high at this point. Will that change? I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
Sure it will.
Well, and the other thing is when you finally interface with a human being, who's doing the interpreting of the data?
That's right.
Because they're taking the data and creating meaning out of it. That's a human component. And humans, there's good guessers and bad guessers. There's good betters and bad betters.
And there's also the biases of programmers. So facial recognition, there have been now a number of lawsuits about this. The identification rate being accurate when it's identifying Caucasians is like in the low 80th percentile, something like that. For Asian and people of color, it's in the low 30 percentile. Mm-hmm. It's programmer bias. Most of the programmers are white males.
Yeah.
And then people extrapolate the information from that, and it's just not accurate. So what questions are being asked? And as you said, so what's the interpretation based on? And what's the universe that's being drawn from?
Yeah. So let's go back to the Apple example with Crush. Mm-hmm. Something got crushed. You've got more of a feel for what happens behind closed doors in, big companies than I do, because I've been strictly entrepreneurially owned businesses for the last 50 years. That's not really a realm of humanity that I really have much insight into. But they were picking up on some sort of data. It's not just Apple, it's whoever the advertising agencies are, their production companies that they're dealing. But there must have been a consensus at a certain point that, what I have a feeling was kind of like Steve Jobs envy. That remember the 1984 video that they did when they brought out the Mac?
Yeah, with the woman throwing the hammer at the screen.
Yeah, and it was the face of
Big Brother.
Big Brother from 1984, the George Orwell novel that had been created into a movie.
By the way, another one that 1984 came and went.
Yeah. I was 40. It was an important year.
But not for the reasons they said. That's right.
Yeah. So the thing is that we need something big. Let's just put out a thesis. They said, there's so much confusion in the technology world and there's so much going. We got to have something that really draws a line in the sand, and this is a new world we're doing. So we're going to take all the ways that human beings have created up until now, and we're going to crush them and say there's a new dawning and there's a new vehicle to create in the future. And it's the thinnest ever, no longer frustrating fat iPad.
That you have to lug around. Yeah.
You have to have a caddy, you have to have
That's right.
Your Mac caddy. So I'm just trying to think, or was it just a bad bet day at Apple. They've done other bad bets. This one just attracted a lot of attention. But I think there's something going on in the technology world that when you sent me that, I said, this is like the 10th piece of information that's talking about big tech not really understanding where the world's going and a certain sense of confusion.
Well, I think for most of our growing up and most of our adult life wasn't taken up with tech somehow being the savior of the economy and all of the...
Or the dominant force on Wall Street.
That's right. So people made fortunes, and all the things that happened before have happened since. I think one of the problems is that the opinions are amplified through a 24/7 news cycle, through the social media, that if you pause during your scrolling on Instagram or look at Facebook and you're always looking at things about innovations and iPhone and everything, you get more and more of that same stuff. And all of a sudden you think that that's the world, when in fact it isn't. And I think so many people's noses are pressed up against the glass and they can't see, as the saying goes, there's no glass in the woods, but you can't see the forest for the trees because you're just so focused in front of it. So when I say don't think of a pink elephant, first thing you get an image of is a pink elephant in your brain. Mm-hmm. And I think that the massive sales necessary to keep this engine going, I'm guessing that as iPhone sales have tapered off, that they figured, okay, so AI, and what's the best manifestation of AI in a product that we have? Well, I think that we could really build the case for the iPad and a new iPad, when the best thing they can say is it's thinner, which wasn't a problem anyhow. You know, what does that do? And it used to be technology was fun. Okay, the fun is gone. And it used to be it was fun. So just to give you another example, just a quick example is the initial personal listening device was the Walkman. I met with Akira Morita and his wife. I was shooting the French collections in Paris, and they passed out around 400 Walkman. So all of a sudden, for the first time, you were seeing trendsetters in the fashion world and celebrities wearing headsets. We hadn't seen that before. You know, so it was this personal listening device, and they had the generic name for it, you know, the Walkman, until Apple came along and outmarketed them. And by that point, Morita had died. But the way that Sony tried to sell the Walkman then was showing you how compact it was and the technology inside. Nobody cares. What Apple did is they showed this kind of animated thing, colorful animated thing of a guy dancing and having fun. And even their more advanced commercials a few years later was a guy dancing up the side of the building, and they were fun. This is the fun you can have with this product. Well, where's the fun? Fun sells. Where's the fun anymore?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's happened is culturally that when the Microsoft of the world and the Apple of the world, this is the late 70s and early, and they were the rebels against the establishment.
That's right.
Well, Apple is the center of the establishment now. They're the most highly valued corporation in the world. And they've lost their innocence. I mean, they were the first company to get a $3 trillion valuation. You know, I mean, that's a big, massive company. And all entertainment, creativity, and humor and everything is at the margins of the culture. They're not in the center of the culture. Right. They're the center of the culture now.
Well, that's right. And when you mention they've had some misses before, their most successful ad campaign for the computer, it was John Hodgman represented, he was kind of the avatar for the PC. Yeah. And I forget the actor's name, the young male who was IBM.
Microsoft or IBM?
Hodgman was just PC, which is really Microsoft.
That's Microsoft, yeah.
And the young guy, kind of cool and casual.
The cool guy.
Yeah, was
the Mac.
Right. And the background was just white, seamless. You know, they were just in a limbo space.
That went on for years.
It was incredibly successful. But the way that it started off, Apple was making fun of PCs in a different way. It was much more kind of hostile. And they found in their testing that people gained sympathy for the PC. So Apple changed their approach and made it more that PC was being deceptive.
Yeah.
When they say, well, our next upgrade is going to do this and our next upgrade is going to do this. Well, the Apple thing does it right now, and it was, you can trust Apple.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting because their first out of the box didn't work, but then that did. And think about what IBM did. They had the Charlie Chaplin character, right? The little tramp. How credible was that with IBM?
Yeah.
Not, right?
No.
But, when you think about back to Apple, you mentioned the 1984 commercial, the things that they did, which was about, this is against Big Brother. This is against the establishment. As you said, they're right in the center of that now. They're no
Well,
longer.
now they're the crusher.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, they not adjusted to their cultural maturity.
That's right. That's right. And they are obviously not the underdog anymore. So then they came out with another product. I wanted to mention this too, the Apple Vision Pro. So there was a week or so when it was first launched that I would see people walking around New York with these big goggles on. And I was with my son and I said, this is not going to make it. This is going to be the same thing as like 3D.
Well, it's like Google Glasses that came out
That's right.
15, 20 years ago.
That's right.
I think any technology that makes you look like a dork.
Yes.
Like the Segway.
Right. Yes.
I was in San Diego and the cop patrol came by and they were all on Segways. And they looked foolish because they had short sleeve shirts on and they had shorts on and they were on a Segway and they had a helmet on. And I said, that must be penalty patrol or something. These are all the cops who got in trouble. They send them out to embarrass them in public. They just look really weird, And the Segways just look weird. They never had it. You know where they made it? In factories that are a mile long. They use Segways to get from one area of the factory to another. But you want this backstage. You do not want this technology. For instance, right. The same thing with goggles. You don't want to see people in public with goggles. They're disassociating from reality. It's like during COVID, a lot of dogs had trouble with people with masks on. Because dogs really pick up on facial features. A lot of dogs just really, really didn't like people walking around with masks. They want the real goods to check out whether this is a good person or a bad person. Well, but I think that the people who would create these technologies are themselves disconnected human beings.
Well, that's right.
So that goes back to the beginning of our story here.
In which way?
The people who made the decision to put this out are fairly disconnected human beings.
Well, because like in most gigantic corporations, nobody is going to speak truth to power. They're not going to say, this is a hostile message. There was an actor strike. The center of it was AI. A writer strike. The center of it was AI. Creative people are having their artwork appropriated, trying to steal their voices and all of that. And then this is what you're featuring that our technology does. It destroys all creativity. This is not a smart idea, but nobody in these meetings ever says that kind of thing. No. I think about Avatar, when the first Avatar came out in the 3D. For the next 3 years, because at that time, the highest grossing movie ever, if you wanted to buy a TV, it had 3D. I didn't want the 3D glasses, and I didn't want that feature, so I didn't want to have to pay for that feature. I went to 2 different major retailers and then went online. Everybody had 3D, Samsung, LG, Sony, Apple, all of them had 3D. And then to try to promote it, they would give you 2 pair of the $75 glasses with the purchase. I didn't want it, okay? Now I see these Apple Vision things. Apparently people, and it's not just that I'm older, young people, like I asked my son what he thought, would you wear that? He goes, no. And it's, gives you a headache after 15 minutes, of doing that. And I would ask a more humanity type of question. Forget it, by the way, $3,500 a pair for those things. That's another thing. The production and projections of that have already been cut in half by Apple.
Mhm.
I predicted when it came out that it would fail.
Mhm.
People don't want to wear that. And more so than looking like a dork, I think it's also, do we really need to be more isolated from each other than we are already, that you got to wear it walking down the street? I think everything about it, might be a nice thing at an amusement park or something.
There's a real role for it because it's augmented reality. If you're wearing it on the street, you're actually seeing the street, but it's identifying with information the stores that you're passing.
Do you think they'll try to sell anything with that, like geolocation for buying? Stop in now and get 25% off your first purchase and all that stuff?
But what I've heard, there's really fast adaptation of it is in skills training, blue collar skills training, where day one, you're a motor mechanic and you have the goggles on. It says, okay, now unscrew this screw and put it here, do this.
Yeah.
Before lunchtime, you take the engine apart. In the afternoon, it shows you how to put the engine back together again. They do that 5 days in a row. On the sixth day, they can do it without the goggles.
Right. And as a learning tool, it makes perfect sense.
I think it makes total sense, but it's not front stage.
That's right. That's right. And flight simulators, right? Same thing. They're not games, though. The flight simulators are as close as you can get to real experience.
Yeah, I've been in one. Yeah.
But when you're walking down the street, when you're isolated from all the people around you, when I absolutely guarantee you that the merchants that you walk by, if they're national or large enough merchants, you will get a promotional message that you can come into the store and get a discount and whatever. It's just more ways to sell you stuff you don't need.
It's the intrusion of commodification into everyday experience.
Beautifully put. You're absolutely right. And that just makes me sick. It's like,
Well, the thing is, it doesn't work.
well, yeah.
I'm just approaching next month. It'll be 6 years since I've watched any television, and I did that because, first of all, the internet gives me all the information I want. It was 800 hours a year. For 6 years now, I'm getting 800 hours back. And I'm mostly reading. I'm mostly, reading books. But I've found better uses of the internet. There's a lot of archives of great movies now. What's it, 50 years? What's the copyright?
IP?
Yeah, the IP on movies, 50 years.
It's longer than that, but I'm not sure what that
But
is.
there's all this film noir stuff from the 1940s and 50s. Yes. There's a thing called Internet Archives now, and they've got hundreds and hundreds. I really like film noir.
Me too.
Yeah. It's the dark spot in our two souls. We sort of resonate from dark spot to dark spot. Anyway, but just suppose that it's my experience that high tech, the companies that are high-tech companies, the advertising of high-tech has become more hyperbolic with the decades. Starting in the 80s, I think 80s is where you started, 80s, 90s, and then we're into the fifth decade. And it becomes more hyperbolic as you go along because it's competing with so much existing technology.
Well, that's true. But I think that one of the major failings is in the Apple iPad commercial, where all the previous commercials that Apple did showed people having fun using the product. They never talked about the technical specs or anything like that. How many humans did you see in that Apple Crush commercial? None.
It was all things. It was
That's right. That's right. I think that's significant. I think that's really significant. It was a machine that was crushing all the stuff that creative people use to create new things.
Since time immemorial.
That's right. Exactly right. And the other thing is that most of us are knowledgeable enough to know that what's happening on a moment-to-moment, second-to-second, nanosecond to nanosecond basis is harvesting data about our behavior. So all of the worst nightmares about these companies, that we're the underdog, you know, they're as bad, if not worse, than the companies that preceded them in terms of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's really significant. You aren't seeing people. We all know the data is being harvested. I believe, and I have believed this for a long time. I said to people, YouTube will have commercials. Oh, it's never going to have commercials. That's what's so great about it. No, it's going to have commercials, and so is Netflix. They're all going to have commercials, except for
Or you're paying not to have them.
yeah, that's right. So what did they do? They actually returned to the original model for television, and they have two income streams. Now you're paying to get rid of them, and the businesses are paying you to put it on their platform.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
television and online streaming is in total chaos right now. They don't know what's going on anymore.
I think there's a fundamental constraint, and that is that the human brain can only focus on one thing at a time.
That's right.
And it has no bandwidth expansion, except that what you're focused on, that's the only thing you can focus on at the time. And you're competing for that one person's, how they're using their attention.
That's right.
It's actually our property that they want to take advantage of. I mean, I wrote a book called Your Attention, Your Property, and, it's just that I choose how I want to use my attention.
Well, and it's like the author we both like so much, Tim Wu, and, how that's become the commodity is our attention.
Yeah.
And I wrote this down because I really like this. This was a British filmmaker, Asif Kapadia, wrote this about the iPad commercial. This is a quote from him. Like iPads don't know why anyone thought this was a good idea. It is the most honest metaphor for what tech companies do to the arts, to artists, musicians, creators, writers, filmmakers. Squeeze them, use them, not pay well, take everything, then say it's all created by them. I think that's brilliant because it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's really interesting because I met these filmmakers at the Tribeca Film Festival this past week. A friend of mine had a film in it, and I met the writer and director couple, and I met the three featured players in it. And it was really interesting because these were people that somehow got their film made. It's an independent film. There is not a false note in it. It's a beautiful story, really well told. And it's a struggle, of course, to get it made. And I'm not saying it should be easy. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that as the scales are tilting, and, the studios were trying during the writer's strike and the actor's strike to cast the actors and writers as being greedy, as the CEOs of these companies are making so much money. And it's kind of fascinating because these people are the engines of new, the engines of innovation, the engines of the stories that we love to hear. And I think they are undervalued. Nobody said it's a level playing field, but I think it was Iger, although he denied it, but from Disney, who basically said, then let the stars make less, we'll starve them out, when the strike was at full tilt. And I thought, wow, so as you guys are making tens of millions of dollars, and there's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of actors and performers that are in that realm, I don't think we realize how dependent we are and how many things good come from that. The film noirs that you love, the music we love, all of these things. It's really interesting. And I think what we're seeing maybe is a shift in terms of what we value. And that could be very interesting.
Yeah. We had a party at the office just 2 days ago for one of our associate coaches and strategic coach who's put in 30 years. And now he's created a new company at 80 that he wants to devote his attention to full time. And there was a person who was visiting. He was a client. He was in the workshop, and he was from Minneapolis, and he had 17 pizza stores that he had bought within the last 10 years. He was talking about it, and I said, what's the name of the pizza, the brand of the pizza? And he says, Red Savoy. And I said, that's interesting, Red Savoy. Where'd that name come from? And he says, well, it was an old factory and it had a product that was called Red Savoy. And the guy created his first pizza kitchen in the factory. And he was looking for a name and he called it Red Savoy. And they have a lot of history attached to it. It's a company that goes back decades, early 1900s. And I said, that's really good. I think that's really good. I think you have something there. It wasn't a manufactured name from,
Market research.
Market research for putting focus groups, or it wasn't based on big data, and everything else. It was just that the guy did it. And I said, I think we're entering a period where retro is coming back. And it's actually among young people, the interest in old things, the interest in secondhand things. For example, lawn playing albums now are back with a very, and the equipment for lawn playing albums and everything like
players.
that. Yeah. Record players. Yeah. I knew there was a name to that thing. There's a part of us that's tired of new.
I think it's that, but I think there's something else that goes along with that. And I think that what it is we all have, and this goes back to our most primitive days, pride of ownership. A link and a download is not ownership. Mm-hmm. And when you have that vinyl album and you've got the cool photograph for drawing on the front and the liner notes on the back, that is something that you possess, that you can hold, that is a physical object. Mm-hmm. That's really cool. Yeah. And I think that pride of ownership is also shifting because that allows you to have something, hold something that has a uniqueness to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a big thing too. And that would be interesting to explore also, because what is it that makes something attractive to us? And I think you're right that more and more younger people, that's why vinyl percentage-wise is still a tiny part of the business, but percentage-wise, it's the highest growth area and has been for the past number of years now, growth in the music industry. Mm-hmm. And it's a status symbol for an artist, especially one that's starting out, to also put their album on vinyl. It's like now, what's the other thing we're dealing with? Instead of movies starting off streaming, only available in theaters. So it's, only available in theaters for those first few weeks now. I mean, I remember growing up when Ben-Hur was held over for like 8 months, at the Village Theater in Fairlawn, Ohio. But I think that there's something that is not appealing about anonymous products.
Well, here today, gone tomorrow products. And I think this is what the big tech companies are running into, is the falling birth rate that is now the majority of developed countries in the world now. They stopped having babies 40 years ago. And they've always depended upon the big booming youth market for new things. And that the youth market isn't there anymore. I mean, the millennials are smaller than the baby boomers.
What is it? It's the Gen X that's the one after millennials, who is another big bump in the population. But
well, the millennials were a big bump after the Generation X. Generation X was right after the boomers. And then the millennials came along, but only in America. The United States was the only one where it happened. And part of the reason is that the U.S. isn't a cityfied country. The majority of Americans don't live in a city, where in Canada, 60% of the population lives in 15 cities. Mm. Because you can freeze to death up here. You want to be close to the fire, But all of Europe, with the exception of France and Sweden, have falling population rates. So, the whole basis for high tech was there was always going to be a growing market. Maybe one of the reasons is there isn't a growing market anymore.
Yeah. And then what do we return to? You reference, and I think I love the way you put it, the commodification of everything.
The commodification of everyday life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the thing about that is when everything is available all the time, nothing is special.
Yep.
And where does that leave you? With, I think, a sense of disillusionment.
Yeah.
And how do you make yourself special? And I think that was a big problem for younger people. Social media started warping people's sense of themselves and how they present artificially. And, what does that do? And now there's clinical evidence of the damage that's done to teenagers and
especially teenage girls.
That's right. That's right. There is such a cascading effect that happens.
Yeah. But I think when you sent that article, when you spotted the article and then you saw the video, it's kind of like a tipping point event.
Yes, I think so too. Yes. Yeah, really, really interesting.
And Apple would be the one that you would least suspect of making that kind of mistake because they've always been good with their consumer advertising.
Yeah, but, they've lost what they had. And that was they could always, even long after they weren't, they could play on being that underdog and hip and all of that. And that, it's just not the case anymore. It's not credible anymore. And they become like these other companies.
Yeah, they're General Motors.
That's right. That's what I was just thinking. It's exactly right. Yeah. Well, do you think we stayed within our boundaries of anything and everything?
Well, we're starting to choose the topics that the boundaries are not visible when we start off speaking, It was a constraint, but we're trying to loosen the constraint. But I think it bears repeating of accumulating evidence that something big and scary is happening in the tech world, not necessarily to us, but the people who are in the tech world, they're up against some constraints that they had never thought would happen.
Well, we're seeing that in the layoffs that are going on and the cutback projections in sales and all these things. But, at a certain point, markets hit saturation.
Yeah.
So it's bound to happen. It's like the companies that did so well during COVID when people were no longer restrained by that. There were companies hotter than hell like Peloton who just collapsed. And got bought for pennies on the dollar as a result. I always look at these kinds of inflection points, not that I am any expert in investment because I am not, but these are the times to start looking on the horizon for what's happening, what could be that next new thing. And I think you're also going to see a lot more conservative aspects happening in terms of, product. It's an interesting time because there's so much going on. And I think that we're hitting on something with both pride of ownership, tangible products. What are these things telling us when they fail that big at a message like Apple just did? And especially with a message within that, how people are interpreting it, that's not insignificant. Mm-hmm. So we kind of missed the mark. You missed everything. And you alienated your own consumers.
Yeah.
That's a big miss.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting time, and I think interesting times create new opportunities.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're always going to be buying stuff. It's just a question of what we're going to be buying.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think this has been anything and everything. We've tried to cover that for you. So thank you all for listening. It's Jeff Madoff with my friend Dan Sullivan. Till next time. Thanks for joining us today on our show, Anything and Everything. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. For more about me and my work, visit acreativecareer.com and madoffproductions.com. To learn more about Dan and Strategic Coach, visit strategiccoach.com.